Okay, today we're going to concentrate on balancing behavioral repertoires. We're basically looking at how to look at behaviours, especially in the area of autism. When you're observing a person with autism, you find that there are behavioural deficits and behavioural excesses, and that's how, for the most part, autism is defined. As we know, it is a diagnosis based on behavioural observations and descriptions, and for the most part, we're talking about some behaviours that are not there in the frequency or duration or intensity that they would be required. They are underperforming certain behaviours and overperforming some other behaviours. So the behavioural deficits, and I suppose this is not a deficit model, this is just a term to be used for behaviours that are low probability behaviours, behaviours that are unlikely to occur at the frequency, duration, intensity, or whatever of same age peers. And those behaviours, for instance, would be vocal language in some individuals with autism. They would be social contact, initiating social contact. There would be eye contact. There would be a whole range of behaviours that individuals with autism tend to not engage as frequently in as typically developing peers. And there's the behavioural excesses that are overperformed. Now, in some of the lectures, we are concentrating on the behavioural deficits because we want to increase those behaviours on whatever dimension they should be increased, and that is to be defined obviously with the family, with the individual themselves. But in other areas, we need to help these individuals to decrease some of the behaviours that they are slightly overperforming or largely overperforming, such as maybe stimming, repetitive, stereotypic behaviours. I don't know, behaviours that they're overperforming, maybe when they are shouting too loud, or other behaviours that they're overperforming, like challenged behaviours. We're talking about behaviours here that are happening at a high probability in these individuals, and that are happening with a much lower probability in their typically developing peers. So when we're talking about reducing behaviours, we are automatically talking about a punishment contingency, because by definition, any consequence that reduces behaviour is just called punishment in the behavioural literature. So the question is a smack, a fine, or an extra chore a punishment? You can think about that for a little while, but ultimately you will find that anything that's called a punishment, that is arranging a consequence of responding that makes responding less likely, that's the definition of punishment. The same as reinforcement is a definition of any consequence that makes responding more likely. The term punishment is used for any consequence that makes responding less likely, reduces the probability of a behaviour occurring. So the punishment effect depends on the relationship between the response and the punisher, or the contingency. It's not just simply on the delivery of a punisher. We need to, in everyday language, we use the term punishment for a sanction, for something bad that happens after you've behaved. And the effort is, the aim is that you therefore don't behave in that behaviour again. But there's usually not the exact contingency measured, whether the sanction actually decreases the probability of that behaviour occurring again or not. If it does, well, then that would be functionally defined as a punisher. If it doesn't, it's not. It might even be a reinforcer. In behaviour analysis, you want to always make sure that you have the function in mind, the function of the consequence, not simply the delivery of something. Now, very often the discussion on punishment goes around aversive punishment. Let's say physical aversive punishment, like a smack. There's a big debate about whether smacking is a good idea, and there are very ardent proponents of the idea that smacking should be legal in the family. It is at the moment in the UK, it is legal in the family, whereas in other countries it's not. It's now no longer legal in schools and public areas. So the only people that are still allowed to smack their children are parents. Other professionals are no longer allowed to smack, and that's not very long ago that this new law has come in. So if anybody's interested in the legalities of actually physical aversive punishment, they can look at that literature. What we want to do is really have a look at the side effects of physical aversive punishments, and then of course we want to look at the alternatives, because there are situations when, even with the best will in the world and with working with positive reinforcement and increasing the desired behaviours, there might still be some behaviours that will need reducing, and obviously we don't want to use physical aversive punishment, we want to use alternatives. But let's have a look at the side effects first of all, so we know why we don't want to use it. Well, first of all, the first side effect is that physical aversive punishment very often leads to aggressive behaviour. You might find somebody hitting out or kicking out when they get physically punished. So that's one of the side effects. And of course, when you have aggressive behaviour, it becomes much more difficult to deal with reducing behaviours. In line with aggression, also physical aversive punishment can cause vigorous responding. So people tend to respond very vigorously if there is an aversive punishment. So we don't want to, and that of course makes it much more difficult to deal with the problematic behaviour, because you might have temper tantrums, you might have aggressive vigorous responding, but you also generally have an increase in behaviour. So then the punishment is not actually a punishment. On the other hand, you might have aversive punishment producing only temporary response suppression, so that for a short period of time the individual's behaviour actually is suppressed and doesn't occur, but it will occur later on again. So it might just be suppressed in the presence of the person that has actually delivered the physical aversive punishment, and will actually still be there in other situations. One of the major problems with this kind of situation is that for a brief period of time, the undesired response will be suppressed, and that in fact will probably function as a negative reinforcer for the person who was using the physical aversive punishment. So on the flip side of a temporary response suppression, we find that the punisher, the person that delivered the aversive punishment, will actually be negatively reinforced by an escape from the aversive behaviour, from the behaviour that they wanted to reduce. So if somebody misbehaves and uses aversive physical punishment, and then let's say the child stops misbehaving for a moment, the person the parent or the teacher who delivered the aversive punishment will actually be negatively reinforced for delivering it, because the aversive behaviour is suppressed for that moment in time. The undesired behaviour is suppressed. So there's a negative reinforcement trap built into this that we need to watch out for. And when you think, as a teacher, maybe you think a punishment would be to send a student who misbehaves, send him out of the classroom. You might do that in the hope that therefore they would then behave better when they come back in again. But that may or may not be happening. For the moment, you have reduced the offending behaviour because the person is no longer in the room. But at the same time, your own behaviour is negatively reinforced because you actually got a bit of peace. And so you need to watch out for that, because you sometimes find that certain teachers tend to use this kind of procedure more often than others because they've already been negatively reinforced for using it. So you need to watch out. The recipient of physical punishment learns to avoid both the punishment and the people who punish. Okay, so when this is particularly obvious when it comes to actually smacking, the person that you are that is being smacked doesn't only avoid the punishment, the smack. They also will avoid the people who punish, and there's a lot of negative emotional baggage that happens with that type of physical aversive punishment. That's what I was saying. There's physical punishment produces negative emotional conditioning, and here we're going back to our classical conditioning lecture from previous session, where the pain of the smack is actually then associated with the previously neutral stimulus of the person that delivered the smack, and therefore then the person will be avoided as much as the smack will be avoided. So whatever the aversive punishment is, so it produces a negative emotional conditioning if the person that delivers a lot of physical aversive punishment is not going to be very well liked by the people, by the students. It could also lead to a general response suppression, meaning that the person stops behaving altogether. Okay, the person could be stunned into not behaving altogether. So you haven't only suppressed the undesired response, you have to suppress any response, and that becomes very difficult when you're then trying to teach somebody. So you don't want to do that. So we've had a list of reasons why we don't want to use physical aversive punishment, and it's important to be clear on those. The list could probably go on a little bit longer, but it's okay for now just to have a look at those. So there are good reasons, very scientific reasons why we don't want to use it. I mean, apart from ethical and moral reasons why we don't want to use it. But we do tend to use it. It is being used much more widely than you expect. And as I said, it's still officially legal in families to be used. So when it comes to alternatives to physical aversive punishments, we're still talking about there's a behaviour that needs reducing. There's an excess of behaviour that cannot be, that we have tried to reduce by just increasing other behaviours, but there still remains. The alternatives to punishments are here. I'm going to talk about them in sort of like a hierarchical order from the least invasive to the most invasive. So there's a number of different alternatives, and we'll start off with the least invasive alternative, which is about differential reinforcement. Now, differential reinforcement basically means that you're reinforcing certain behaviours differentially. You're concentrating on the reinforcement of certain behaviours while you're not reinforcing others. There are a number of different differential reinforcement procedures, and if you have got your simple steps pack, there are some concrete examples on in the videos, so I advise you to have a look at those. The first one is a differential reinforcement of other behaviour. This is basically a procedure where you reinforce anything but the undesired behaviour. So you make a list of, you write down, or you be very clear about the undesired behaviour, and you set up a schedule of reinforcement for anything but. It doesn't really matter what the person does in that. They get reinforced, the behaviour gets reinforced as long as it is not that particular undesired defined behaviour. And sometimes it works quite well in situations where you have an offending behaviour, but it's very difficult to get actually a proper alternative, or get a very identified behaviour that you want to reinforce. So say, for instance, you have somebody with high levels of self-injurious behaviours. You might reinforce anything that is not self-injurious behaviour, and you might say, okay, we'll have a reinforcer every 5 minutes, every 3 minutes, every half hour, depending on the level of the self-injurious behaviour. And there's a reinforcer delivered as long as the self-injurious behaviour has not occurred in that period of time. The reinforcer will be delivered. It'll also be quite a good strategy for classrooms where you might have a very disruptive student in your class, and you can come up, you negotiate with the student that there will be a reinforcer delivered every so often in a regular time intervals, as long as he's not disruptive. And this is quite a good procedure. It's quite a loose procedure in terms of what kinds of behaviour the person might engage in, but the more concrete is a differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviour. So here we are much more clear about what kind of behaviours we are reinforcing specifically. These behaviours are incompatible with the undesired behaviour. So if somebody, say for instance, I don't know, rocks up and down, rocks back and forth all the time, and that's the undesirable behaviour, you reinforce sitting still in the chair, okay? Or if somebody shouts out aloud in class, you reinforce speaking quietly, so that you can't speak quietly while you're shouting out loud. So you have to actually think very carefully about what is the undesired behaviour and what is a behaviour that is incompatible with that particular behaviour. And then your schedule of reinforcement concentrates on that. Another differential reinforcement is of alternative behaviours. Again, you go very carefully and have a look at the undesirable behaviour and have a look at what would be an alternative behaviour. So if a person shouts out loudly, and the alternative would be to write a sentence down, what they want to say, that would be the alternative behaviour. So you would then reinforce the writing down behaviour rather than the shouting out behaviour. Another differential reinforcement is either low or high rate of behaviour. This is really when the behaviour itself is not the problem, but the rate in which the behaviour occurs is either too low or too high. In the Simple Steps pack, there's a lovely example of a young man who, when he's asked a question, he always refers to his mother for the answer. He says, "What should I say, Mum?" And he does this at a very high rate. Well, in and of itself, that's not a problem behaviour, because it's okay to ask your mother sometimes what the answer is. I mean, I think he's about 12 or 13, isn't it? So at that age, it's fine to sometimes ask your mother what the answer would be. But he does it for every question. So what the schedule he is on is on a differential reinforcement of low rate of that behaviour. So for instance, he is given permission to ask that question 3 times during the conversation, but no more than 3 times. So he's reinforced as long as he only uses that referring to his mother 3 times. And the same is similar schedule would be if you differentially reinforce high rate behaviours. You would take a behaviour that is happening at quite low rate, and you would reinforce it at a higher rate. Okay. So there's very inoffensive alternatives to physical punishment and aversive punishment, because you're concentrating actually in your reinforcement schedule by defining the target behaviour, the undesired target behaviour that you want to reduce, by looking at either other behaviours, incompatible behaviours, alternative behaviours, or low high rate of behaviours, and you set up a differential reinforcement schedule for those. Here is a summary of differential reinforcement procedures. Just as a recap, you can pause it here and have a look at those examples a little bit more. Okay, the next procedure that you could use to reduce certain behaviours is around extinction or planned ignoring. Now, we need to talk about extinction and planned ignoring at some length, because there's a lot of sort of common parental advice, like if you don't like it, just ignore him and it'll be okay, and he'll not do it if you just ignore him. Now, that advice is while it's very useful at some level, it's also quite tricky, because extinction is actually a process that is quite a complicated process, because as we know from all the research that when we start a behaviour here, say at a level of this, say 8 dimension, or whatever the frequency or whatever it is, when we put the behaviour on extinction, in other words, when extinction is defined as a previously reinforced behaviour is no longer reinforced, so we withdraw the reinforcer of the behaviour, what we find is reliably that the behaviour will go up first. There will be an extinction curve. Whatever the dimension of the behaviour is, whether it's frequency or duration or intensity or whatever, there will be an extinction curve. That means the behaviour is going to get worse before it gets better. And this is researched on lots and lots of research articles. This is a known fact. In fact, whenever you start ignoring a behaviour to reduce it, and it gets worse first, you know you're onto it. Okay, this is what you can say to parents whenever, or your colleagues, whenever you're trying to put a behaviour on extinction, when you're actually ignoring a behaviour. If it gets worse first of all, we know that we're actually on it. Now the problem is that when it gets worse to the top here, what very often can happen is, if you don't warn the person that you're working with, like in my example now, if you don't warn the parent that it will get worse before it gets better, they might give in at the top here and reinforce the behaviour at the top here at 16, where the problem behaviour started off at 8, We've now got it up at 16. If it does get reinforced at this point, well, obviously then the behaviour has learned that in order to get the reinforcer, I need to up my game a little bit. So it's very important that a parent understands about the extinction burst before they engage in extinction procedures. But eventually the behaviour will go down in terms of whatever the intervention is that you're working with. And eventually, if you keep ignoring it, it will eventually go down, and that's the important point. Another important point that we need to explain to parents is the spontaneous recovery, that at some point in time, and we can't predict this completely, but we know that at some point in time there will be a recurrence, there will be spontaneous recovery of the problematic behaviour, and we need to be sure that we continue to ignore the behaviour at this point. There might be another one here, a smaller one, but if we reinforce up here again, we're back to that spiral of increasing the behaviour again. So if you show a parent this graph and or this kind of graph, or draw it up for them, and you explain to them first of all about the extinction curve, and second of all about spontaneous recovery, not only do you help them to make an extinction procedure effective, you also whenever it does happen, because it's guaranteed to happen like this, they will be very surprised how you were able to predict that it would happen. But it's science that's predicting it. It's not you. It's just you knowing about the science. So this is a very important graph if you're explaining to somebody about ignoring or putting a behaviour on extinction. Because the definition of extinction is basically a previously reinforced behaviour is no longer being reinforced. The reinforcer is taken away. And this is a predictable pattern of behaviour that you will see when you do that. Okay. So it's important to know that that is a predictable pattern of behaviour, to be prepared for it, and not to use extinction unless you are prepared, especially at the top of the extinction burst, not to give in. So unless the person that you're working with, like in my experience, I've done a lot of parent training, so unless my parent is not prepared to go through the extinction burst with their child and not reinforce a behaviour, we better do something else, because extinction isn't going to work. It could actually make it worse. So it's really important to know that. Now, I can't show you this next video, but it's a lovely one. It's on YouTube. I couldn't find it again, but it's a lovely one. Whenever you sort of imagine yourself in front of the lift and the lift door doesn't open, and you press the button lots and lots of times, and then eventually you give up. But first of all, you bang it, or also on a slot machine or on a drinks machine when the drink doesn't come down, and you basically hit the machine over and over and over again. Okay, so the next alternative to punishment, and as you can see, we're getting into the heavier stuff here, is reducing behaviour with response cost procedures. Now, response cost procedures are really procedures where the undesired behavioural response will have some sort of cost to it. Typical examples would be taking pocket money away or something like that. Now, funny enough, we're talking about quite a hefty procedure here. We've already had like a whole, this is what about the fifth or sixth one down in terms of aversiveness. We don't want to really go here if we can avoid it. If we can do a differential reinforcement procedure, that's really what we want to do. If we can't do a differential reinforcement, that's really where it should be. We might look at extinction, but response cost is actually quite a hefty procedure. And yet, when you think of teachers using golden time, that's time where the students on a Friday afternoon are supposed to have, they've earned golden time to be able to do whatever they want to do, work on the computer or whatever. Gives the teacher a bit of time to tidy up for the Friday. And what usually happens is that the teacher says, okay, you have half an hour's golden time, but if you misbehave during the week, I'm going to take 5 minutes off of your golden time. That's a response cost procedure, okay? That's a hefty procedure. We don't want to really do that. What we should be doing is say to the children, you have 15 minutes golden time, everybody, and you can earn another 15 minutes in 5 minute slots. So you give me reasons to make you earn another 5 minutes, and you can do, and the teacher knows that each child can do that up to 3 times per week. Well, you're going to have kids trying to earn more golden time. And that's obviously a much more positive procedure than a response cost procedure. And yet we tend to think that a lot of teachers use that response cost procedure because they don't really understand necessarily what they're doing. But this is a hefty procedure that we want to avoid if possible, because you're actually taking something away. That if you have points and you're actually losing something, and it's getting quite aversive because people don't like losing things. They prefer gaining things. So we want to really work with differential reinforcement. But we can work with response cost because so the undesired response costs something, whatever it might be. We can also work reducing behaviour with stimulus control procedures. So we are actually it's not too hefty, but we can actually use stimulus control to reduce behaviours. Okay, I mean, for instance, you could arrange a room so that undesired behaviours don't happen so much. That procedure is actually used quite a lot in trying to reduce behaviours of children with autism, in that the classroom is designed so that problematic behaviours don't occur. Now, that you might want to do that at a very early stage in the treatment program, but you certainly don't want to do that in the longer term, because if you impoverish the environment for the person with autism, they can't learn to behave in a full typical environment with all the stimulations that are around. So if you use stimulus control procedures to control certain behaviours, you need to be very careful what you're doing, and you need to know that that is what you're doing. And you might want to bring the stimuli back as soon as the behaviour is under control, but it's a hefty enough procedure. You could also eliminate an early component of the behavioural chain, because as most of you probably know, problematic behaviours usually happen in a sort of a long chain of events. Very often they don't just happen out of the blue. There's usually a build up to them. So you might be able to eliminate an early component of a behavioural chain. Okay, so that that ultimately you're change one of the behavioural components, and the behaviour then doesn't go down the spiral of undesired behaviours, but actually can be brought into a more positive direction. You could also change behaviours and reduce behaviours by observational learning. Observational learning is a very strong procedure that we should be using a lot more than is probably used for the most part. We can remember that a lot of behaviours are learned through observational learning and modelling, and we have had a look at modelling and observation in a previous lecture. But it is important to remember that if we don't behave in a certain way, then we don't expect our students to behave in a certain way. One of the examples, for instance, if we want people to keep appointments, then we should be keeping appointments with them. That's an easy one. So that's a good example for observational learning. If you don't want your child to use rude language, don't use rude language yourself. Certainly not in front of the child. Examples like that. I think I'm always intrigued in the area of bereavement, for instance. People saying my child can't cope with the loss of his granny or something like that, and yet you fall apart in front of your child. Then the child is learning through observation how to behave. Children learn through observation how to behave, and that's desired and undesired behaviours. Of course, children also learn for reasoning and rules, but the important thing is that we can make reasoning and rules, and in the classroom we very often start with rules, the rules of good behaviour in a classroom. But what we need to remember is that rules are just verbal instructions, and in and of itself it's important that children learn to follow rules, and that we don't expect that they have already learned that when we are actually dealing with children in the classroom, or that we don't expect that we say a rule to a child with autism if they have never learned to follow those kinds of rules. Now, rules is usually a thing that children with autism can follow quite well, but then we have to watch out also that they don't get too rigid in following the rules. Here's a nice example, and again I can't show you that it's a YouTube example of somebody in an exam not following the rules. Sorry about that. Reducing behaviour with timeout procedures, timeout from positive reinforcement. This was probably be one of the procedures that most of you are familiar with, and that's why I want to spend some time on timeout from positive reinforcement. It is very, very important to remember that that is the full title of the timeout procedure. It's not timeout. It's not putting somebody on a naughty chair. It's not sending somebody out of the room, putting them in the corner. It's not about that at all. Okay, what timeout is really about is timeout from positive reinforcement.